So last night, well, just actually yesterday in general, with all of the events that took place in Capitol Hill there, let's just start with some initial reactions to what is being called, at least in the mainstream, an insurrection. I know lots of different perspectives on what it was, what happened, but that's kind of the mainstream focus. But obviously, we saw a lot of stuff happen. David, why don't we start with you in terms of what your thoughts were on what you saw yesterday in general?
Well, yeah, insurrection, I saw that term being thrown around. I mean, in a sense it was, but I think we have to really kind of look at this from the lens that, the U.S. Capitol was one of the most heavily guarded and difficult places to breach in the country, if not the world. So the fact that there was really no resistance at all to a breach. And in fact, it looked like, even some of the Capitol Police were abetting the protesters and sort of allowed them to go in. So I fully, after analyzing it, I fully believe that, this was essentially allowed to happen. For what reason, we can certainly have a discussion on, but it was certainly a lot of theater. I immediately thought of the famous quote, "The world's the stage," and I thought this was more theater than it was, actual violent insurrection, although there was violence. But what was disturbing to me is that, I've studied sort of police departments and how they've conducted themselves over the past year. And, The Intercept recently ran a really great report on how white nationalists have infiltrated a bunch of police departments. I think that you have a lot of MAGA elements within a lot of police departments. So, this was a stark contrast compared to other protests I've been to, even on the ground personally, where there's been a heavy police presence where they've laid down the law, if you will, for protesters protesting a number of different things. But in this sense, there was clearly a lot of coordination between law enforcement and the protesters, if you want to call them protesters, in my opinion. And I think what was most disturbing to me is that you saw sort of a disparate impact and a disparity in terms of how protesters in America are treated. These people were really treated with kid gloves. I mean, I think if this was a Black Panther protest on the Capitol, you would see people shot, you would see violence. They would never be allowed to breach the Capitol and take photo ops inside the, senators' offices. So I think there's a lot of theater here, but there's also a lot to learn about America and the way that there's a clear disparate impact in terms of who the protesters are and how they're treated by law enforcement.
Well said. Before we unpack some of the stuff in there, I thought I'd give Madhava a chance to dive in here, throw down his foundational view, and then we'll go into some deeper stuff.
Well, David, you said a lot there, and a lot of it is how I feel. Let's not forget that, buildings in Washington, D.C. are not necessarily insurmountable. As we know, the Pentagon can be easily crashed into by planes. So I'm kidding, folks. Yeah, I have to say that obviously this is less than 24 hours after the events. So I have nothing but questions in my mind. Mm-hmm. And the biggest point that you hit, David, I'm fully behind you. I mean, this is clearly a double standard of security forces. Police, I mean, Black Panther, forget Black Panther, even BLM, it would have been met with a shock and awe kind of response if there was any sort of breach of a public building. So that's really where, that I think that's the biggest issue of all of this is like, well, how did this possibly happen without, some sort of complicity or arrangement between the protesters and security. The biggest questions beyond that I have really had to do with the procedural elements of what was transpiring inside of the chambers. From what I heard on C-SPAN, there were reasonable protests, or at least ones that followed the protocol of whatever article that is of the Constitution of bringing up objections to certification, and we can get into that, but that's where I would really like to focus as well.
Yeah. Interestingly, you guys both brought up kind of the protest, I guess what we saw from the police and what they allowed. And what comes to mind for me is, I was on the ground in Standing Rock and G20 here in Toronto, all that sort of stuff. So I've kind of seen, and I went to Occupy Wall Street a little bit as well when it was in New York there. And I kind of had seen a lot of different types of interactions with police. And one of the things that I gained from a lot of it is when there is, somebody mentioned photo op, but when there is that photo op moment, police stand down. I don't know. I can't claim to know, like, I don't know why. Like I watched in G20, I had a camera. I was at the front of this big march of what was essentially like Black Bloc, which was just a whole bunch of face covered, younger type, protesters, if you will. You didn't really know what they were there for. They were all dressed in black and they had weapons, and some of them had police boots and billy clubs. And like, you could tell that a lot of people suspected a lot of them were cops, but, the police car was set up in the middle of one of the busiest corners of all of Toronto, and they just they set it up there on this beautiful angle to set up this amazing photo op. And I watched because I was at the beginning of the line, and the police were down a side street and they were all retreating. And we're talking like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of police retreating. And they retreated enough so that the protesters could basically destroy the financial district, burn the car. And the people that were doing a lot of this stuff were the same people, and I have this all on camera, were the same people that were then running towards the police. The lines opened up, they went through the police, and then the lines closed back up, meaning they were obviously police officers. And what I found fascinating about this is as soon as that stage was done, everybody that was sitting in the Queen's Park area afterwards, whether they were white, black, Chinese, brown, whatever, got the shit beaten out of them. Right? They got absolutely destroyed, pepper sprayed. It was horrible. It was what you would have expected out of a Black Panther type situation. So I wonder, any thoughts on, David, you alluded a little bit to the some of the white supremacist idea of breaking into the police officers. Like, do we have any potential agendas? Like, why would there have been a potential collaboration with protesters and police to stage this event? Why could there have been that in this particular instance?
Well, I think, you have to look at the fact that by and large, police unions and police departments across the country heavily supported Trump over the past 4 years, and even, felt emboldened by Trump to go out and, really exercise excess force against protesters that they don't like. But then when there's protesters that they like, they sort of take them at arms and look at them as a band of brothers type mentality. So I think that, you have a clear situation in America where police departments, even if you look at the history of the police, as I think we've discussed before, I mean, the police, in its origination started as an organization in the South to come and take back slaves, runaway slaves. Like that's how the police were founded in the United States. And unfortunately, after the Civil War and through the period of the Reconstruction, you had heavy infiltration of the police department within the KKK and other white supremacist groups, and that legacy lives to this day. So, but in this situation, I think you have to look at, this was a highly predictable event, right? Everyone knew this was coming. You had Trump giving essentially a pep rally to that same group before they actually descended upon the Capitol. So law enforcement knew this was happening. To me, the only logical explanation is that there was sort of this stand down mentality that you were talking about at the G20 that allowed this to happen. Now, did they allow that to happen because they were essentially in lockstep with these insurrectionist protests? Probably. I think so. I think the logical conclusion can be that the reason they were allowed to do this is because they wanted to make a statement, and they wanted to show that essentially, police is in solidarity with Donald Trump, which I don't think is a big surprise to a lot of people.
Madhava?
That is hard to argue with. But if we go, another layer deep, which is what I think you were alluding to, Joe, is, these are staged situations. One image that's being circulated around social media right now is this guy with a Q emblazoned T-shirt inside one of the central halls of the Capitol building, looking kind of evocative. And it's being talked about like, look, these guys stormed the building. They broke down barricades. And what's fascinating is that I got a hold of a video, I think it's by this guy, Sean King, who posted it, tweeted it. And it's that very same guy, same T-shirt, right? Basically just walking up the steps with one single security person, just sort of saying, hey, stand back. He brandishes a billy club, but doesn't use it. He pushes the guy with the Q shirt. The guy doesn't push back, and they sort of walk into this room and say, we have a right to be here.
Yeah. So
the point is that it's being, construed or spun in two different ways, or it's being spun in one way, like, and you can see the guy is like, my height, maybe 5'7", but in the image, he's this big guy, but he's actually a very small person. Anyway, so to answer the question, there may be, let's just say that there is a double standard. There is some need or desire or feeling that these people are going to be treated differently. However, it can be easily spun, as it is being right now, to be like, look at these Q supporters and Trump supporters. They're violent. Mm-hmm. They broke down barricades. Of course, they must have broken down barricades because it's the Capitol building during the certification of one of the most contentious election cycles ever. So they must have been violent, right? And so it may play against them. I mean, that's the way I see it. I feel like it's being played in a way to further delegitimize the potentially reasonable protests or objections to the certification.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a number of eyewitnesses that were there, sort of say that, and everybody has a different perspective on this, right? And sometimes they have their own bias, as we know too. But a lot of people there were saying, there was the Trump rally, and then there was a small group of individuals that didn't really feel like they were part of that same rally, that were the ones that ended up in the most photo op type op, situations that we saw. So actually inside, sitting in the chairs, climbing the walls, doing all the crazy things. People have been suggesting and kind of showing different pictures and stuff like that, these people were representative of a different group, which kind of leads to where I want to go in terms of why they were even meeting, in the first place, to have this electoral college vote on the presidency, and the idea that there was objections to the validity of the election in general. I was watching C-SPAN before everything got sort of canceled, if you will, for the time being. And, they go back and forth, right? So you hear from a Republican, you hear from a Democrat, and, they go back and forth, saying whether they, when they're arguing over, or debating, I should say, over whether or not the Arizona results should be counted. And what I was hearing from the Democrats was sort of this lockstep position of, nope, just accept the results. It's a threat to democracy if we don't look at them. And what I'm hearing from the Republicans is, what we're asking for is an investigation. And we're just not sure that this election was as secure as you think it is. Let's go into that. Let's go into what we think the main arguments and whether or not the Republicans will say, do they have a point here? Should there have been an investigation?
Well, Ted Cruz was arguing, and I think he actually was one of 6 who actually voted yay that they continued their objection even after the madness that occurred in the Capitol. It went well into the night, but he was arguing that they wanted to form an emergency commission to analyze the election and make sure that there was no fraud. But, I think Mike Lee actually made a great point. That's not the role of the Senate under the Constitution. That needs to be taken up on a state-by-state basis. You have to go to Arizona, you have to go to Pennsylvania, you have to go to those state legislatures. And if you think there's election fraud, state by state, they have to deal with it on a state basis. This is not elections are done on a state-by-state basis. It's not the role of the federal government or the Senate to come in and essentially tell them that, hey, there was election fraud in your state. And in Arizona, for example, I mean, they have, it's actually bipartisan when you look at who the Secretary of State is, who the governor is, who are the election officials who actually certify the results. They didn't have any objection in the state. So if they say that, if they certify, sign, seal, deliver the election, it's not the role of the Senate to come in and question that and say, oh, no, you guys got it wrong, especially if they can't present any evidence to that effect. So I think it was, again, complete partisan posturing by people like Ted Cruz, who I think are really probably lining themselves up for a 2024 run and, want to appear like they're still holding the fort down. And even Ted Cruz kind of alluded to the fact that there really is no substance behind the claims, but he said we have to acknowledge the fact that a large percentage of Americans believe there was election fraud, which he's correct. But if just the belief, let's say there's 30 to 40% of American people who think the election was rigged. Okay, we can acknowledge that. But are they correct, right? Just because people have this belief doesn't mean that we should give credence to it if they can't produce substantial evidence. And we've been over this many times. I mean, Trump's legal team, it was a joke. I think that there's a discussion to be had about election integrity because our system is vulnerable. There's no doubt about that. But you can't sort of pick and choose when you think there's election fraud and when there's not, based on whether you like the results or you don't.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a high integrity way to go about this. And so, I think if we're going to have that discussion, it's going to have to take place over the course of a long period of time, as opposed to just trying to sort of overthrow and overturn the results of an election just because you don't like the results.
Yeah. Madhava?
Well, I'm not the authority on this at all, but what I gathered, and this is where I wanted to take this, is that it seemed to me that the Republican Congress folks that were raising concerns and offering their objection were basically saying that their own state legislatures were overruled by federal courts during the certification process. And that's how I understood it. Like, we didn't follow due process, and for some reason these things were overridden. So, if that is true, and that's where I'd love to hear what your take is on that, that's sort of the other end of this, is that if we're saying that, it's up to the states, it's not up to, us in Washington, D.C. to make these kinds of decisions. That's actually what these Republican state representatives are saying, that it is up to us, and yet we were overturned. So that's where I think the real issue is. I mean, obviously, we all have our particular opinion on how this should go. Maybe you don't, Joe, because you're an unbelievably a neutral human being. But the reality is the constitutional process being taken seriously. So that being said, and I don't want that point to get lost, but what I thought was interesting was that the comments from Lindsey Graham, amazingly, seemed to say, guys, it's over. We need to get on with things, which kind of shocked me, honestly. Did you happen to catch that? But before you respond to that, tell me what you thought about that. Was that the nature of the protests from the Republicans?
Are you asking me or David on that one?
Either one of you, someone who knows more than me, which is both of you.
I think political correspondent David over here should throw in some more, I guess, the legality thoughts on that, because I think you probably have a better understanding than both of us.
Well, I mean, the legal challenges were largely coming from the Trump administration. So, there were some, there definitely were some people, like, for example, in Pennsylvania, who refused and were sort of rebelling against the results. But ultimately, the legal challenges came from Trump's legal team, and essentially all those have been thrown out by the federal courts. And I think for good reason. Again, if you're going to mount a legal challenge, it has to have some viability legally in order for it to be heard by the court. So I think the problem with the legal challenges from the jump was that they were really just kind of jumping the gun on the assumption, and they also weren't questioning the results in the states that Trump won. So I think you have to look at this from a fair-minded perspective. And again, I do think we have challenges with election integrity, and that's why the Congress should have passed Tulsi Gabbard's bill on election integrity, which would have a paper ballot backup system to all the elections in each state. But I think the fact that Lindsey Graham and even the senator from Georgia, Kelly, who actually lost, she actually withdrew her objection as well after what happened yesterday. So I think, again, it was more political posturing than having an actually legal standing to challenge the results. But if, I'd be curious to hear your perspective if you saw something different. But I from the jump, I remember when we had this discussion a few months ago, I didn't see then any legally viable challenges, and I don't see now. A lot of it to me is just about political posturing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would kind of agree with, a lot of the conversations I was having yesterday, watching what was happening was very much what I felt. And just for people that are listening that don't know, like, I live in Canada, I'm Canadian. I don't have any desire to engage in U.S. politics in the sense of choosing a side or anything of that nature. And in that way, sometimes you get a fun outside lens that can be a little bit extra unbiased, I guess. I don't know. You could tell me if I have bias when I say what I say, but I kind of looked at it and I felt what I was seeing and what I was feeling. And I guess you could say what was coming, from my heart was this feeling of like, we have all these representatives that are, arguing and like you said, politically posturing, basically standing in lockstep, almost not in every vote or every situation, but they're kind of just sticking with their party line, right? Like, even the discussion of election reform was brought up, and 100% of Republicans said yes, we're down to start discussing election reform, and 100% of Democrats said no, we're not interested in discussing election reform. And for me, with the information that I know, the research I've done over the years, and even speaking to some people who've worked very tightly within politics in the United States, including yourself, David, it's kind of like, it's obvious that there's issues with elections in the United States. Like, it's not even a secret that Dominion voting machines or other voting machines in general have huge potential issues. And the fact that there would be an entire party completely unwilling to discuss that, to me, it presents a very clear picture that I think we've often intuited, but also can see in the evidence, that people are not really represented by, we'll say, major levels of politics. And when I say that, we're talking when we get up to the state and federal levels, it almost becomes too big to really consider what the people want. And that to me was confirmed yesterday in seeing so much of what I saw. Not to say that we can't discuss nuance on some of these topics and really get into that, but that was the general feeling, is like, look, there's this game over here that we call politics where people are going to play it. And I'm not sure that the voices of the people are really heard. And that was some of what I took, especially discussing what we were just going with there.
Again, I agree, Joe. And I think that's also another reason why really the Senate is not actually the best forum for a real investigation and a real analysis of election integrity to take place. Why? Because it's the most partisan forum there is. So, if we're serious about it, we would form a commission, but the commission wouldn't be done in 5 days. It would be done over the course of probably 90 to 200 days, where we actually have data scientists who are looking at what happened in the election in each state, and people who really are neutral and are looking at this more from a scientific method in terms of looking at the mathematics, looking at any type of deviation in the algorithms, to really identify where the problems are, if there are any. But for the Senate to try to just form a commission, as Ted Cruz was suggesting, which didn't get any support even from Republicans, to me, it was really just about more political theater, and we've seen a lot of political theater this year.
Yeah. Madhava, anything to add on that?
Well, first of all, I have to start by saying that, you don't provide an outside lens, Joe. I mean, isn't Canada just a territory of the United States?
Yeah.
That's the way we see you. So here's where I would like to say something, which is, we don't know really how much we know. There's, the integrity of these, the system is not 100% secure. But what I thought was interesting was the arguments from the Dems, at least in the C-SPAN. They were in lockstep, but they weren't actually addressing what the concerns were. They were just saying, look, it's over, guys, let the American people decide. And yet, the Republican representatives from Ohio, Arizona, they were like, look, here's the evidence. Here's 1,000 affidavits.
Yeah.
Can we please have someone look at it? And then you'd have another, rebuttal of the rebuttal saying, let's just move on. And, that to me is very, very familiar, right? When we have like debates, they're not actually, we don't have debates anymore.
Right.
We just have people saying what they're supposed to say. Then the next person says what they're supposed to say. And then it goes back and forth. And then whoever has the most votes in the House wins.
Yeah. So
there isn't any real exchange happening here. These aren't really debates.
Yeah, and I think this is what's representative of the very idea that I think we're past a point where I notice this, and this might be a biased judgment, but at the same time, I strongly do feel this. But it's like I feel like the U.S. sometimes has culturally like a love affair with their past, in the sense of it's like, oh, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, and what this was all set up for, and like, well, this is the greatest country in the world, and it's kind of like, yeah, but it doesn't actually function like what that history states, meaning, are things actually at a situation where people are represented by all of these various forms? And do things, does the open debate and the sacredness of democracy, is it actually represented when you have a media that is controlling almost the entire narrative of what's going on, when you have social media in alignment with that, controlling what is being said and what is not being said? From my perspective, an entire 50% of the population who is essentially gaslit for 4 years on saying that every perspective they have that's contrary to the mainstream is somehow wrong and they're crazy. That this is very much, to me, like you were saying, Madhava, the idea of, you look at the debates and it was Trump and Biden just whining back and forth to each other for the most part, and nobody really addressing each of the concerns. And I think it goes back to, it's like, when there's honesty and transparency and even in the electoral process, like, it's obviously a very difficult thing to run an election and then have a short period of time to somehow come up with all the evidence in the world to prove that, it was fraudulent, right? That's a very difficult process. And it just screams to me like there's a deep foundational change that has to occur here where, people kind of have to stand up and say, look, I don't have faith in these institutions. And I think people who don't have faith in these institutions now, who are being gaslit into saying that they're just crazy, I think those people have a really, really good point. And sure, there's some extremism there, but I think they have a good point. Let's just cap this off with talking about a little bit of that. I don't want to say extremism in like from, the standpoint of like, oh, this is an extreme view, this is an okay view, you're allowed to have this view and you're not allowed to have, I'm not trying to say it in that way, but we'll say when we look at some of the QAnon, for example, perspectives out there, or some of the stuff where we've seen the media spend a lot of time trying to put a certain group of people who had questions, all paint them with one brush. These people, anybody who has questions are all QAnon bad people. Right? So if you're losing faith in the institutions, it's because you're part of QAnon. Let's talk about that for a second, because we obviously did have some extreme voices the last 4 years, but we also have a lot of people who are losing faith. Let's touch on some of what's going on there with that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of excellent points to consider. I think that when you look at QAnon, in a sense you're right. I mean, how it's been effective. And of course, my belief is that QAnon has been a psyops that has really just spun out of control. But, if you're going to now just basically dismiss any skepticism of the government, or you're going to dismiss any viable inquiry into where conspiracy may occur within the government, and you're just going to say, oh, that's just QAnon nonsense, that becomes a very convenient way to just en masse dismiss otherwise, intellectually viable challenges. And we do have a record, high number in terms of people who have lost faith with our institutions, and for good reason, because our institutions have failed us by and large.
Yeah.
However, those behind QAnon have really done a disservice to those people who are outside the U.S. Capitol, in my view, because they fed those people lies and propaganda. And this became this dogma, this became this prophecy, to where they felt, based on, I can't tell you how many astrologers I saw who were talking about, oh, the stars are aligned, the Jupiter, Saturn conjugation means Trump is going to win, we're going to overthrow the government, it's going to be the second revolution. Well, this actually took root into a lot of those people you saw in the U.S. Capitol, to where they were really acting on this sort of prophecy mindset, where if they actually storm the Capitol, then the prophecy will come true. So I think that the real danger in this is not recognizing that a psyops can take place and we can be a victim of it and not even know it. Of course, that's how you know mind control is effective. Mind control isn't effective if you're aware that it's happened to you. It's only effective when you think it's not, you're not susceptible to it. And thus that's when mind control is working to perfection. So, I think we really, when we look at the phenomenon of QAnon and how it really has been used as a propaganda arm to the Trump campaign, I think we're going to have a real discussion, and also a compassionate discussion, not just to make fun of people who latched onto it, but also to look at how we've been just beaten down by programming and conditioning in media in this country to be conditioned so that we are actually very susceptible to that kind of programming, particularly when we are getting our news from a very slanted source, whether that's mainstream news or whether that's just your favorite sort of, alt media account on Instagram where you're getting all your information from. So I think what I saw yesterday also was a very dangerous precipice, sort of a crescendo of all this propaganda coming to fruition, where, yesterday could have been infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more violent. Really, in totality, I mean, we lost one life, unfortunately, but it could have been far worse. And, had some people really gone all in on this mindset that the second revolution is coming, it could have been a lot more bloody and violent.
Yeah. Well, I think, that the painting with a broad brush is the most dangerous thing that's happening now. Because, like you said, both of you, a very, very important aspect to how to move forward is how much trust that we put in our mainstream media. And a great way to either gaslight or subdue that kind of skepticism is through something like Q, who's basically saying the news is fake, don't trust it. But then they have these, really destabilizing platforms, and they missed the mark on many, many other things. Just like, a great way to suppress the 9/11 truth movement is to create a flat earther movement. So that is really a huge danger, and it's working because we've become a world, a species that doesn't know how to pull things apart anymore. We've been told, like, this is what we should be believing by one source or the other. And most people believe, what the scientific establishment or mainstream narrative is. And with giving it very little, they give it such presumptive legitimacy. So I think that's a huge problem, and it's not going to be solved by, changing the governmental structure or the process that we use to vote, getting rid of, Dominion machines. It's like, we have a problem. We have a problem with understanding what is and what isn't. And I don't know how to fix it unless we have small little grassroots discussions one at a time that can only, approach things, from the side to get people, like you said, David, how are you supposed to see that you're mind controlled? You can't. Someone else has to point that out to you.
Yeah. Well said, both of you there. And, I think this leads back to kind of the crux of the ethos that, we tend to think is so important, which is the personal transformation end of all this, right? Like it's, I've had some discussions with other speakers lately who are, just exploring the idea even with them. Like, do you find that being able to make sense of reality as much personal transformation as, self-regulating your emotions, for example, or tuning your head and your heart, into coherence with one another, such that your decision-making and cognitive process is actually better, right? Some we view as a little bit more meditative transformation, and others we look at a little bit more logical, right? Learning how to use our minds to sense make. And both of those aspects are personal transformation. And it just seems like it's very much a key time, not only to say that that's what's needed, but to plug CETV, because that's what we like to do there in CETV. But with that, is there any final words you guys want to throw in on this before we cap it off?
Well, yeah, I just like to echo what both of you brothers just said, and now it's more important than ever to go within, as we like to say, and to really exercise a higher discernment than ever, because there's so much noise and narratives are being spun a million miles an hour out there that it's very easy just to get lashed onto something. So I think, as a final thought, I'd like to challenge all of us, including myself, to really take a look at our world, our reality, and look at if there are forces that are trying to get you to pledge an allegiance to any particular identity that doesn't really suit you, be it if you have to always take the Republican line, or you always have to take the Democrat line, or your identity is just your gender, or just your background, or just your education, or just whatever it is, because that's going to cause you to see things only through one angle, and you're going to be subjected to that bias without being able to really discern in a way that I think is going to serve you ultimately when it comes to trying to make sense of this world and trying to make sense of our place in it. So, as we sort of move on to this next phase in America with the Biden administration, I challenge a lot of people like me who were very critical of Trump over the past 4 years, not to just take our hands off of it and say, oh, well, everything's going to be fine now that we've got this new administration. And in fact, this could be a dangerous time to where people are lulled to sleep. And there's sort of an architecture of control that comes into place to try to solve all of this political and social unrest in our world. So, we really have to reach within to try to filter things in a way that is more in line with our higher purpose. And that can be a challenging journey, but I trust that we're all up to it. So thank you for having me, Joe.
Well said. Madhava?
I would like to say, and I think I'm going to make this sort of my go-to concluding statement for all the content we produce, which is, just an appeal to the listeners here, the viewers. We all have sort of slightly different, or maybe moderately different perspectives on what just happened yesterday and where this is going. And I know it's very easy to comment or respond about how our conclusions are wrong. But I would suggest to everyone, rather than going straight there, go to how we can be better at articulating what is actually happening. Like, where have we misstepped? Joe and David and myself, like, are we making too many assumptions? Where are your assumptions? Like, can you see that you disagree with one of us or all of us because of a foundational assumption? And look at that first, because that's the way to negotiate such complicated storylines here is, what is the foundational belief that may be based on uncertainty, and work from there. And that's the way to move forward, I think.
Well said. I concur with you both. And thanks so much for coming on and having this discussion. I know it's early and there's still so many details that I'm sure will emerge in the coming days, but these are the initial observations. So thanks so much for coming on, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, guys.
Andy, thank you both, brothers. Good to see you both. Happy New Year to everyone.